In the third part of the Critique of Pure Polemic, I shall be focusing on common themes that arise in refutations and in sort of this refutation culture. The first such theme that often arises in refutations is, generally speaking, that of misunderstanding and misinterpreting. Now, just to make it clear, I'm not pointing fingers at any one side or putting the blame on any one side. This is simply addressing common aspects of refutations that are proposed by certain groups within these refutation circles. Many a times when you see people refuting other ideologies, they tend to misunderstand or misinterpret basic concepts. By doing so, they tend to portray them in a negative or bad light, thus presenting it to their own followers as perhaps an evil or absurd or illogical concept. And this actually leads on to the second point, that they fail to then contextualize this concept in its rightful context. And furthermore, they do not contextualize that concept within the system of those who utilize it. For example, to perhaps use a less controversial example here, people may attack tradition or ideas of tradition because they would assume that it's merely backward superstition or illogical practices passed on from previous generations. But it fails to contextualize that most societies have agreed upon a certain set of traditions, as it was the collective wisdom of the society over an organic development of generations upon generations, and thus those who would adhere to this tradition would argue in their system that it is simply the collection of wisdom of their ancestors. To be fair here, this does not make tradition infallible. Tradition, at the end of the day, is another human endeavor. It's another human institution that is developing over time in various contexts, in various civilizations, in various eras. Hence, tradition is subject to human error like all other human institutions. But the point to be made here is that those who would adhere to tradition will not understand this concept as an illogical one. Rather, they would actually think of it more as a logical one, and they would argue that those who do not adhere to tradition are in fact the illogical ones. The third point that often arises is that people often fail to take a principled approach to certain issues. They will accuse the other side of all kinds of things, but are not self-aware enough to realize that those same accusations also apply to their own side or to their own concepts or their own ways of thinking. The very simple response to this kind of a refutation would be for the side which is the subject of that refutation to simply point out the inconsistency within that side's refutation because it contradicts their own views. And this leads on to the fourth point, that these kinds of refutations then tend to lack any real sort of consistency. This is because they fail to apply those same standards that they are applying to other groups to themselves. This can even be seen perhaps by failing to apply them to those groups who they are more friendly with. It ignores common ground with the other side based on things that they're trying to refute, when in reality, in many cases, they have misunderstood those concepts. And to those who they are more friendly with, if those same accusations apply to them, they will still not refute them based on that. Hence, it shows a kind of inconsistency and a kind of an illogical approach. An example that can be given here is that most ideologies and most sorts of groups or religious movements in principle would reject and condemn unnecessary, unprovoked, unjustified violence. However, many a times what you will notice is that these same groups will defend their extremists, meaning they will go to the extent of downplaying or denying the kinds of crimes that the extremists of their various groups have committed. For example, Christians or classical liberals may do this with Christian fundamentalists, or Muslims may do this with Islamic extremists, or leftists might do this with, let's say, communists. So, if the opposite side or another group was to do the same thing that their extremists did, they would condemn it outright and they would accuse the system itself of causing it. But when it comes to themselves, when their extremists do a thing, they don't have that same consistency where they won't accuse their system of doing it, but they will say that they perhaps didn't do it, or they will downplay its importance, or they will say that it wasn't because of their systems of thought. But if another side's extremists were to do it, they would accuse the system itself of being at fault. This also goes back to what I said in the last video, that although these systems in theory are perfect, human application is always imperfect, and these theories, so to speak, are implied in an imperfect society, in an imperfect world, in imperfect conditions. Hence there will always be error and some kind of violence that may be associated with it. Of course, this isn't necessarily the wisdom of those systems leading to that violence, but these negative things are an inevitable result of human endeavor in anything. This then leads on to the fifth point, that if their side does something which they accuse the other side of doing, in reality for them it's okay, and they will rationalize it and justify it for a few following reasons. They will either explain it away, or they will figuratively interpret it, or they will say that it's not the same thing as what the other side is doing supposedly, or that it's a one-off, or at least it's not as bad as what they did kind of situation. The sixth point then is that often at times in these polemical situations, what happens is that there are semantic word games that are played. This is because when we get to the crux of an issue, beyond superficial arguments, we find this kind of semantic stalemate where neither side makes any progress. So if there's a fundamental issue, when we get beyond these kinds of vague and very basic arguments, we find that at the crux of that issue, there's a very basic semantic disagreement. The disagreement is either on a fundamental rule or principle, or if two or more principles are in conflict, one side will emphasize one principle over the other, whilst another side will emphasize another principle over the other. This fails to take into account the nuanced nature of reality, and that all of these principles must be taken into account. For example, some people may take liberty as a principle and focus on the liberties of man and have a more libertarian approach. Others may focus on safety and having a more egalitarian and safe society. These two groups may disagree with one another, but in reality, beyond a certain point, this difference is arbitrary because both of these values are values that are important to the human condition and in fact necessary aspects of any society. So it should not be an or-either binary discussion. We should take a nuanced reading where both the principle of liberty and the principle of safety are taken into account. The seventh point to be made is there tends to be a fundamental philosophical or metaphysical principle that's disagreed on, and this disagreement leads to all other secondary and tertiary disagreements. In other words, most polemical disagreements can be traced back to one fundamental disagreement on a philosophical or metaphysical or social principle. At times, it could be a combination of these issues at play. And what actually does happen is that a number of issues are added onto the main crux issue, which leads to a polarization of the discussion where a friend of a list of these principles goes on one side, whereas the enemy of one of these principles is by essence the enemy of all these other principles and is hence polarized to the other side. We can see this in the right-left political divide, where if you disagree with one set of principles, you're automatically on one side of the discussion, and if you agree with another set of principles, you're on the other side of the discussion. These disagreements have philosophical implications because all metaphysical and philosophical points or principles, those points will have implications in one's worldview and how one views the world.